The notion of land can be emotive. When you think of land, it can conjure up all sorts of different things: ancestry, ownership, power, heritage, exile, belonging, boundaries, rights, work, exclusion, familiarity, access, to name just a few. Land inevitably has become synonymous with groups or families or nations of people, and the relationship, as we all know too well, hasn't been an easy one. To this day, wars are waged, lives lost, judgments made, scores settled, resentments fostered, all in the name of land. Which takes us rather neatly to today's reading, which is the parable of the sower. In your mind, revisit for a moment those words from Matthew's Gospel that we heard. They're famous, they're familiar, they're actually the stuff of Sunday school lessons and illustrations. But for a moment, revisit them through the lens of someone of Jewish heritage, hearing those words perhaps even for the first time. Because when you apply that lens, there becomes the distinct possibility that the tone of the parable begins to shift from a sense of the farmer contentedly sowing his seed to a picture that might actually be a bit more uncomfortable or even inflammatory. I don't know about you, but the parable of the sower will forever be coloured in my mind by Sunday school and the memory of pictures of a very benign looking sower calmly scattering seeds left and right. Maybe with some imagination, it's worth remembering that even 2,000 years ago, the concept of land had very strong connotations, and certainly to the people of Jewish heritage. They held very firmly to the belief and absolute conviction that the land on which they lived had been bequeathed specifically to them by God. So if you look at the parable through that lens, then the potential enormity of the message suddenly begins to stand out. Because the seed is scattered far and wide with a kind of blanket randomness. It's not scattered specifically on one piece of ground or reserved for one area of the field. It's scattered far and wide on the good ground and on the bad. Surely that would have been enough to stir up debate at best or indignation at worst. The suggestion, the idea that God the sower would sow seed indiscriminately, that it wouldn't be targeted, wouldn't have been a notion that was a natural bedfellow with the truth that religious individuals of the day would have held so dear. In actual fact, that might even be a hard truth for some people today to hear. A reminder that we can't limit God to our time or to our church. We can't fit God into our way of believing or reduce God to the parameters of our understanding or even prejudices. God will always be bigger and more inclusive than we like to think, and thank goodness for that. So the parable, I think, offers us a pretty challenging but ultimately liberating perspective on God, with at least two things to reflect on. Firstly, there's a staggering breadth and equity to God's reach. God's word and influence is sown far and wide, where you'd expect and where you wouldn't expect. And secondly, the conditions of people's lives, our lives, don't have to be perfect. God's invitation, the sower's seed in other words, is offered freely to us, irrespective of where we are and what we might make, or indeed be able to make, of it. And that is a startling truth. That's what's liberating. that regardless of our response, God's word makes its way to us. And when it does, it's not all or nothing. It's an offering to us. It's incremental. It's about promise and potential and growth. We're being expected to nourish the seed, not to produce the fully grown plant. And finally, let's hope that wherever the seed lands in our lives, firstly, may we recognise it, and secondly, may we have the courage to nurture it and watch it grow.